Hello. Hi everyone, we're so excited to be with you. I am Priscilla Lane, Director of Student Support.
And I'm Ms. Caroline Scott. I'm the middle school counselor.
We have some wonderful little cards to pass out to you today. Rolanda will be passing them out, but for a minute, we have them in Thai and English. So as he comes around, if you want the Thai version, just have one finger up. Thai number 1. If you want the English version, 2 fingers. Okay, he's right there. And he's gonna be coming around. Okay.
All right. So welcome to our talk. We're gonna be focusing on relationship-based parenting and the idea of restorative practices. We are going to be moving quickly through the information, but the slides will be available to you later. And also, for those of you that are intrigued by what we're saying, we will all be going into some of these concepts more deeply in our active parenting course.
And we are so excited to share this concept with you because it is a really, really important topic that can help you not just in your relationship between you and your child, but you can also apply this concept to your relationships with colleagues, friends, and others. All right, so we're going to start with a quick fill-in-the-blank quiz. Your children have been tested a lot, now it's your turn. So this is just a complete the sentence. If a child doesn't know how to read, we
teach.
Good job. If a child doesn't know how to swim, what do we do? If a child doesn't know how to multiply, what do we do? If a child doesn't know how to drive, what do we do? If a child doesn't know how to behave, what do we do? Do we? Do we teach or do we punish?
Yeah, and I think we'd like to think we are teaching. But what we're going to show through this presentation is that sometimes with our best intentions, even though we want to teach, that's not what we end up accomplishing.
So our objectives to accomplish today is we want you to understand the powerful effect that shame has on an individual, has on your child, and can even have on ourselves. We're going to explain how the restorative process is a tool to mend relationships and cope with shame. And we're going to look at 2 contexts, both for you as a parent mediating a conflict between your child and another sibling or a cousin or a friend at school, and then also these strategies can apply to mending a relationship between you as a mom or dad and your child.
So we're going to just quickly provide some definitions of words that will come up in the presentation. When we talk about punishment, people often use it interchangeably with the idea of discipline. There is a difference. When we talk about punishment, we are causing suffering for past behavior. When we talk about discipline, we're talking about trying to teach someone to learn from their mistakes. We're also using the word restoration a lot in this presentation and focusing on restorative practices. Restoration simply means to make things whole again. And then, when we do our role play, we talk about person responsible. That's the person who was the wrongdoer, the person who did something to harm someone or harm something. And then the person harmed is the person who was affected by the wrongdoer's behavior, so the victim.
Just a brief background on where this concept came from, because Ms. Caroline and I did not make it up ourselves. It actually has a really rich history, which has been used in a variety of contexts, but probably most powerful and famous is after the genocide in Rwanda, the country was left with having to provide healing between the victims and those who were also country citizens who had done horrible things to their countrymen. So they used the restorative process as a means to bring healing. It was so effective that it was also adopted by South Africa and many other nations to bring healing within a nation.
And it's not just used globally. Restorative practices are now used widely in schools and in our school right now as well. So when a student does something that affects the relationship between them and a teacher, or them and a student, or more people than that even, we try to help them solve the problem and take responsibility for their action by making things right again. So we really focus on helping them understand their role in the situation and who they affected and how to take ownership and responsibility for their actions. And restorative practices are very key in our active parenting classes. So even though if you've taken some of my active parenting classes before, we haven't used the term restorative practices, but the philosophy and the approach is very much developed and explored in our active parenting course, because it's a great way to approach problems at home with your children, and it's a really great tool for improving communication within the house. And for those of you that have already done this course, you know that establishing open communication is one of the fundamentals of being an active parent.
So what we're claiming is that restorative process works for all people in all circumstances, in all cultures, and in all times. And that's because it's truth and it's connected to who we are as humans. And it's a very human, relationship-centered approach to dealing with harm. And it's well worth your time and attention today. So thank you.
All right.
Restorative process is basically a lens through which you view wrongdoing. When you take a lens up and you put it on your eyes and you're looking through it, you kind of see everything a little bit different. So we want you to take the restorative lens and look at wrongdoing as a violation of relationships, as a violation of people. Not so much a violation of a rule that was broken, but taking a look at who was hurt by the action, what harm was caused. Then when you have that, you need to give the person who did the harm a chance to take responsibility for their actions and mend the harm. The goal is to get the relationship back to where it was before the harm was done.
So I'll give you a quick example of what we mean here. So the situation is a child took her friend's computer without asking first and then accidentally broke it. The parents of the child punished their child, so they grounded their daughter, and they paid for a new computer for the friend.
So I am the child who took the computer from Caroline, and I broke Caroline's computer, and my mom and dad very nicely paid for Caroline to have a new computer, and then they grounded me. So Caroline, I've been grounded, and my mom and dad paid for your new computer. Are we good now? Are we friends?
No.
What?
Well, you took my computer without asking. You broke my trust.
But I already received a consequence. But are you feeling that didn't fix our relationship?
Well, it didn't solve the problem of you taking my computer without asking first.
Interesting. I'm really sorry that I did that. And I want us to have a good relationship again. So I want to ask you what I need to do to make that relationship right.
Well, I think just saying sorry like you did and understanding that you took something without asking really helps. I'd also like you to promise that you won't do that again, because I was really upset.
I can definitely do that.
Okay.
Do we need to hug?
Sure, let's hug.
So what we want you to see from that is that the punishment or the consequence didn't fix the relationship between us. And what restorative process does is it provides a high level of support for the wrongdoer which was me, because I'm sure all of us have done something wrong before, and how does it feel when you do something wrong? Awful.
Bad.
So bad. So you want to remember to give support for the wrongdoer and voice for the victim. Caroline got to say what she needed to make our relationship right, not somebody else. And that's what Abel's able. And just another note, both of us are willing to mend this relationship. If I were not sorry, this actually wouldn't work. And we get that. That's a conversation for another time. This is for two people who do want to mend a relationship. So it's a very powerful approach to discipline, focusing on harm, and the inclusive process. Another thing to take into consideration when looking at the harm done is everybody who was hurt. So in our example, my action not just hurt Caroline and was shameful for me, it also hurt my mom and dad. It was shameful for them. It caused them money. And then going further, it may have affected Caroline's ability to complete her homework. It affected her mom and dad because they were sad. It probably dragged the school in. So you need to look at the whole picture and the history. It would have been important to ask me why I did that. Maybe Caroline broke my favorite shoes 2 years ago and I'm getting back at her. The timeline of the incident and the background is also important.
So when someone is hurt or a mistake has been made, basically these are the things we have to understand, which is just recapping what Priscilla had said, but understanding what happened and the why, understanding the harm it caused, holding those responsible for the harm, and coming up with a plan to fix the damage. Now, we as parents know that our children can act out, can be difficult at times, and because they're our children, we often have a very strong emotional response to that. What's really helpful, and we explore this a lot more in the parenting course because it's kind of a difficult concept at first to understand, but it's that all behaviors have a purpose. All behaviors are trying to meet some sort of unmet need. So the idea is that then all misbehavior is a child expressing their need in inappropriate ways. Often children and teenagers don't know consciously what that unmet need is, but their behavior can give us clues. So for example, you might have a teen or a child in your house that is expressing anger, throwing a fit, and that could be them trying to meet their need for attention. Now, if you ask them, hey, what need are you trying to meet? They probably don't know. But by understanding that all behaviors have a purpose, you can start to not react quite as quickly to when you see the behavior, and instead think more like a detective. What is this behavior trying to tell me, and what's going on here? I think we've all seen that with our children on our phones. They don't want to talk to us. So what kind of need are they meeting there? When we understand that all behavior is really an attempt to meet an unmet need, we can try to then problem solve and approach the behavior with the child a little bit differently. But what typically happens, and this is no fault of our own because we're humans, is that when our children misbehave, they trigger an emotional response in us, and we immediately tend to respond from that place of emotion. So if they're yelling and screaming at us, we'll feel disrespected, and we often will then try to discipline them by giving them a consequence, like maybe taking their phone away from them for the next 2 weeks. But if we're not really understanding why they're doing what they're doing, and if we're just reacting from that place of anger, then what we're doing is we're punishing and not teaching them. And that punishment often triggers shame because kids who know they've made a mistake are aware of it, and that awareness makes them feel shameful.
And I think we all know how powerful shame is, and it's not a very popular topic. If we had told you we were going to talk about shame today, probably you guys wouldn't have come. But I think it's important to know the effects of shame that it can have on your kids, that it can have on you, and a lot of behaviors that your child is doing, and even that we do as parents, is coping with shame. So let's pause it and take a little minute to see what shame looks like. And I think no one shows shame like a dog. You can always tell. They just wear their emotions on their sleeve, and of course you have to have the cone of shame. Shame is a biological response in humans. It causes our face to get flushed, the muscles in the neck relax, the head goes down, the shoulders stoop, and a natural coping mechanism is to avoid eye contact with the source of shame. So if your child is in trouble from you, they're not going to want to look at you. They're not being disrespectful. They're looking away from the source of shame as a way to cope. It's not a nice feeling.
And sometimes as parents, we look for that reaction in our children. We want them to hang their head down, look shameful, because for us that tells us, hey, they're getting this. They understand that they've done something wrong and they feel bad about it.
Just one last thing, the good thing about the human response to shame is yes, we all feel it, but the natural reaction to shame is a desire to mend, fix, and restore. So just like experiencing shame is very a natural human feeling, so is the desire to mend, heal, and restore.
Now, the problem that I think we run into as parents is that we don't spend enough time on mending and fixing the relationship. We see that they feel shameful. We understand that they're now in a place probably ready to learn from their mistakes, but we don't spend a lot of time fixing the relationships that were impacted. Instead, we end up focusing a lot more on what are the consequences we can give them, what's the punishment that they can receive so that they'll remember not to do this again. Well, the problem there is then that shame stays, and what they remember is the shame and not the lesson we're trying to teach them. And the long-term effects of shame are that it lowers self-esteem, it reduces people's abilities to take risks, it affects relationships, and it can lead to harmful coping strategies.
When Caroline was talking about every behavior being a response to something, this is a very well-researched compass of shame, and it is the different places we as humans go to deal with shame in a very ineffective way. And I think an example would be if, like me as a mom, I heard a friend say to another friend that I was a bad mother and I never spent any time with my children. Okay, well that just brought shame on me, so I can tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to attack the person who said it, and I'll say, that's not true, she doesn't know me, she's a worse mom than me. Okay, I feel a little bit better. Or I might attack myself and be like, well, yeah, I am having a really hard time spending my time with my kids, so like I know I'm a bad mom. Maybe I'm going to go and have a whole lot to drink, maybe I'm going to recluse, maybe I'm going to avoid others or hide. These are all coping mechanisms that I'm sure you can identify in your kids that are really just trying to deal with shame.
So, taking a step back for a moment and thinking about our parenting styles, the authoritarian response, that's that traditional mode of disciplining children by using punishment. So somebody, for example, your child breaks a plate, right? Then we send them to their room. They have to stay in their room for the next 2 days because they broke the plate on purpose. So with this type of parenting, we're saying, all right, you're to blame, and what's the punishment? You need to learn your lesson. I think maybe some of us in here, that reminds us probably of our own experiences as a child, being told that this punishment will help us learn our lesson. So why do we do it? As parents, we want to make sure that children are paying for their mistakes. They need to learn their lesson. It can solve things quickly. A quick punishment, there you go, you're sent to your room, or no phone for the week. It's often very easy to do this. I think one of the biggest reasons is tradition. That's how many of us were raised. That's what we know, and we survived it, we're fine. And so we often model what we know. And usually that idea of giving a consequence or punishment tells us that, hey, we're doing our job as a parent. And the problem, though, is that this whole idea of punishment and giving negative consequences is that it's based on this crazy idea that we need to make a child, in order to make a child do better, first we have to make them feel worse. Okay? But the reality is that children do better when they feel better, and so do we. We're not saying, though, that there can't ever be consequences. We certainly need children to be held accountable and take responsibility. It's just about how you go about that process that is being tweaked. Okay, so the other reasons why punishment in the long term is not a style that we want to promote is because it develops these kinds of behaviors in children. So if you use punishment frequently, you could build resentment. Your child is thinking, this is unfair, I can't trust adults. You're going to have a negative relationship. Punishment might create revenge-type behaviors. So the child will think, well, my parents won this round, I will get them the next round. Rebellion, that's just outright defiance. Well, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. I'll show you who's boss. And then there's the other type of behavior that might develop. I was guilty of this as a teenager, is retreat in the form of sneakiness. I'm not going to get caught next time. And then another consequence of that too is just feeling like you are a bad person. All right? So we would like you just actually for a moment, just talk at your tables and reflect on your own experience as a child. So we've shared that our experiences certainly were authoritarian. Punishment was widely used in my house. Think about your own experiences. If that's the style that was used when you were growing up, whether it was your teachers giving punishments or your parents giving you punishments, how did you respond to it? How did it make you feel? Did it ultimately change your behavior? And how did being punished affect your relationship with your parents? So if you want to just share at your table for a minute, you don't have to share with the group.
It's your chance to talk to a neighbor. Go.
If you want to just think about it quietly, you can as well. Feel free to speak in Thai, then we won't know what you're talking about. I tell them things because I was always in fear of, well, if I tell them, then they might not like it, they might not let me do what I want to do, they might ground me. And because I was being sneaky, I knew that I was doing things that was harming the relationship with my parents. So ultimately, even though my parents were trying to teach me lessons, it was damaging our relationship and it wasn't changing my behavior.
And I can also add a bit of a different experience. My parents were very strict, and I did come from a very ordered household. However, whenever I received a consequence for my behavior, it was clearly explained to me by my parents, and it was repeatedly reinforced with, I love you, and I want you to be a better person. which is why I'm giving you a consequence, because I don't want you to do this again. And it was a lot of I love you reinforcement, and after I received a consequence, my parents would reach out to me with a hug, a conversation, tenderness, sadness that they had to discipline me because it made them sad as a parent. I could see that. And the other thing, somehow they were able to communicate to me, was that when I did something wrong, it really did embarrass them. And it did bring shame on our family. And my parents had employment that was very much in the public eye. And I knew I was being watched more than maybe other kids. And I understood that, and that helped me behave, and it changed my behavior. So maybe a little bit of a different.
We'll talk about this in more detail if you join our active parenting class. But we put this up here really to highlight that there are different styles of parenting. Most of us were raised with the authoritarian approach, which focuses on obedience and punishment over discipline. Permissive is something that sometimes happens in reaction to authoritarian. Well, my parents were super authoritarian, therefore I'm going to be the opposite. But going too far the other way also has its drawbacks, because then there's no rules and no boundaries. Uninvolved, none of you guys are uninvolved if you're here. Yeah, but basically that means parents who are too busy to have time for their children. It's the most damaging form of a parenting style. And then in the top, we have authoritative. And authoritative is also what we call active parenting, but it's just that parenting that is a high level of support as well as a high level of accountability. And Priscilla will explain that.
So what you want to think of, punishment, you're doing something to the child, like when I got the consequence for hurting her computer. And then with restorative, we're doing something with the child. So that's when I got to receive a high level of support, because you guys know when you do something wrong, you feel awful. And that's the time when your kid needs your support, not an extra dosage of shame. And we solved the problem together. We discussed the consequence together. So it's a high level of support with a high level of accountability, and it's doing things together, not to the child. So this is a beautiful concept called hating the sin and loving the sinner. And that's what you kind of want to separate in your brain when you're dealing with your child. You are still 110% loving and supporting your child, but their behavior was bad. It's actually a good idea to voice, you are not a bad person, but this behavior was very bad.
And sometimes you might see the child themselves telling you that their response is that they think they're a bad person. I know sometimes in my own house when we're talking about consequences, my child will say, it's just because I'm so stupid and I can't remember anything. And right there you can see the shame and the level of embarrassment, and that's something you want to address right away. No, you are not a stupid person. What the choice you made wasn't great, but you are very smart and I love you very much. So something to keep in mind with this process is it is a process because it's about focusing on the relationship, and there's no easy way to mend relationships, but there's certain ways we can go about to approach it. So the restorative approach focuses on solving problems with the child. So if you don't have to give a consequence, if there's a solution you can find together, that is actually a lot more empowering. With the authoritarian approach, we often tell the child what we want them to do, and in permissive parenting styles, we often try to solve the problem for the child. So for example, they might be having difficulty with their teacher, so instead of helping them talk to their teacher, often we might just go and talk to the teacher for them. So we really want to focus on doing things with the child, and when you give them support to help them solve their problems and take accountability for it, you're really empowering them. You're helping them be the kind of person you want them to be in the future, which is someone who is responsible and takes responsibility for their actions, and a problem solver. All right, I put this up here because how we talk to our children is just as important as what we are saying. And we have a phrase in my house that's tone check. So sometimes, for example, if you look on the cards we gave you, one of the first questions to ask is, what happened? But there's a big difference if Priscilla was my child and I said, Priscilla, what happened? To, what happened? Right? There's a difference. So how we say it really does matter, and we want to check our tone. So sometimes when I'm talking with my children, and I'm angry at the time of the discussion, first of all, I probably shouldn't be having that discussion at that moment if I'm feeling really angry. But two, that's often sometimes where my partner or my child might say to me, hey, Mom, tone check. And they'll go, oh, yeah, okay, you're right.
The next question on here is, what were you thinking at the time? And that's another one that, if asked in an open, matter-sensitive way, you're going to get some really interesting answers to what your child was thinking at the time. A lot of times, it wasn't, most of the time it wasn't, well, I wanted to get in trouble and be mean. There's usually something else going on. So you don't want to say, what were you thinking? You just shut them down. It's a really good question that will give you some interesting responses. Just say, what were you thinking? What were you thinking when that happened? And then, what have you been thinking about since it happened? And then another really good one is to ask the person who did something wrong, what's been the hardest part about this for you? How often is the wrongdoer asked, what's been hard about this for you? Because it is hard to be in the wrong.
So we're going to just talk briefly about, there's two contexts that you will use the restorative practice with. The first context is fights between siblings.
Or cousins or friends or classmates.
Yes, exactly. So in that situation, you would be the mediator. So you would help the children or the teens talk about what had happened. And again, you can see on the card that there's questions to ask the wrongdoer, so the person responsible, and there are questions to ask the person harmed. It's really important when you're mediating, though, that like Miss Priscilla said, the person who did the wrongdoing actually feels sorry. You wouldn't want to put them in a situation where they have to talk to the person who is harmed if they don't feel sorry. That's only going to make the situation worse. So you've got to wait to have the conversation until the person who did the harming is ready to own.
To accept responsibility.
And then the other context is your child and you. In this situation, there wouldn't be a mediator, but you could still ask the questions to your child if they've done something that has hurt you and harmed your relationship, to try and repair it.
And then the really difficult side of this, but it's really important in maintaining relationships with our children, is our own ability to acknowledge when we've done wrong. I mean, I know I've done wrong as a parent, and there's been times I need to apologize to my kids, and I want you guys to think, was there a time in your childhood when you felt your parents had done something that hurt you and needed to apologize? And if they did, that's not something we as parents are good at, but it's something that's really important in maintaining a relationship with our own kids.
Yeah, so we're going to model, do we have time?
We have 4 minutes.
Okay, we don't have time, but that's all right. So when you're doing these practices, something that is helpful is having that little card next to you It might seem funny to be having a scripted conversation with your child, but I would suggest just be open about what you're doing. Hey, I learned about this new approach to having conversations. I would really like it, the next time there's a problem, if we could try to use these questions to help guide our conversation. Usually kids are really supportive if you tell them what's going on and why you're doing it. A lot of the times they'll be really happy that you want to do something to improve your relationship. And they kind of get a kick out of that as a parent, you have homework too.
And your kids want to have a great relationship with you. That's just a fact. So you're already starting from a good place.
Yeah, and then something to keep in mind too, parenting is an art and a science. So with the restorative practices, you're getting a theory of how to approach a problem, but it is not an exact science. There is an art to parenting, as we all know, and some guidelines that are helpful in these conversations is when you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the solution in this situation? How can you take responsibility for what happened so that our relationship is fixed? You might be discussing consequences. So in the first example we gave where Priscilla's parents bought me a new computer, maybe a more appropriate solution would be Priscilla has to work and earn some money in the house in order to pay her parents back for buying her friend's computer. And that would be an example of a consequence that is related to what happened. It's respectful because we're not trying to shame Priscilla. It's reasonable because she was the one who broke the computer. Now maybe the computer is like 30,000 baht and that's just impossible for Priscilla to pay her parents back as a 13-year-old. So they might say, look, you need to do chores for the next however long.
Make a contribution towards the total cost.
Yeah. So you do want to keep that in mind. Is it a reasonable consequence? And then the last one I really like is it helpful? Is it helping the person who is harmed? Is it helping the wrongdoer take responsibility? And I would say when you have these conversations with your children, teaching them that consequences need to be these 4 things is really empowering. So in my family, my littlest one will always tell me that it's not respectful, Mom. And that's because he really hates consequences. But it's great because he feels empowered in these discussions, even though he's small.
So I think our key takeaway today, I know we went over a lot of stuff, but what I want you guys to go home and take to heart is that relationships matter. And the most important relationship, perhaps, is that relationship between you and your children. So when you look at punishment, discipline, consequences, take a lens that looks on healing and mending that very precious relationship between you and your children.
And these are some resources that you can refer to. One's a podcast, it's a solution-focused podcast. Then there's a book on restorative parenting, as well as another handout on what restorative justice is. So if you're interested, please do follow up with those resources. And that's it for today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Caroline and Ms. Priscilla. That was fantastic. So hopefully that has encouraged some of you guys to stay behind and sign up for the active parenting class. The one thing that I would like to reiterate that Ms. Priscilla and Ms. Caroline spoke about is they started talking about with kind of how we were most likely disciplined and treated as a child when we made mistakes. It's hard to change those things because those things are a part of us. So the one thing that I would like to emphasize is to give yourself some grace. Use all of these strategies that they just presented tap into the resources of the podcast, tap into the resources of Miss Priscilla, Miss Caroline, the classes, all of these different things, but to know that it's not so easy as they just presented. Because we all have that baggage of how we were disciplined and everything else, it takes time and it takes practice to change those things. So when you do make an error or misstep and then you go to sleep and go, oh my gosh, I just shouted at my child over X, Y, and Z, and I shouldn't have done that. I should have engaged in a conversation to work through that. That's okay. Because then there's tomorrow, and when we wake up tomorrow to say, hey, you know what? Mom really messed that up. I'm really sorry with how I responded to that situation. Can we sit down and have a chat and work through this? My response was not okay. You still can be upset with whatever the action is, but to say, I love you and I messed up. So that's something I really would like to emphasize with everybody, and to remember that we are still human. We will still make mistakes as well as parents. This is new to all of us, and all children are different as well. Their reactions and their behaviors can be very different. So that's something just to remember. Okay, we covered a lot of information this morning, talking about outdoor trips, looking at standardized testing, and then parenting, all on the day before the week break. So before we exit, I know some people are going to stay for the ski meeting. If they were signed up for the scheduled ski trip, we're going to meet at about 9:15. Shirley and Mr. Jim are going to attend that meeting. But before we depart, are there any burning questions or anything that people would like to know or just share before we leave for this morning? Okay, and you're welcome to stay after and ask some questions as well. If you are interested in signing up for active parenting or the home alone class, please stay behind so we can get your name on there. We really would love that active parenting class to happen. And the one thing that I will leave you with, wherever everybody goes, I hope everybody enjoys their family time over the next week. Please make sure your child has a book with them or something to read. Okay, I know I'm already having that struggle with packing as well, and just to make sure that they've got something to keep reading while they're on break. So thank you for a wonderful parent coffee talk this morning, and we'll see you after break.